Hello, are you confused on what to main for your raid in Dragonflight? This is the right video. I'm going over all of my predictions for the Dragonflight raid meta by building the quote-unquote optimal raid comp. I'm going to be putting out a video soon on my predictions for the Mythic Plus meta, so if you're interested in that, definitely subscribe. And with that, let's get into it. So before we get into what individual specs are doing very well on beta right now, which we will be getting into in just a minute, I just wanted to give a quick overview on the raid buffs coming to the game in Dragonflight. All of the Shadowlands raid buffs are returning. There is a few new ones as well, all listed on the screen. The only raid buff that is coming to the game that you really don't need at all is the Evoker Blessings of the Bronze, which is a 15% movement ability cooldown reduction. You can definitely get away without this. Additionally, this upcoming raid has a lot of fights that will benefit greatly from Death Knight Death Grip, so it's definitely recommended you have one of those in your raid. Because of this, there are 3 classes in the game that provide very powerful raid buffs that can only play DPS specs, so you'll definitely want at least a Rogue, Mage, and Warlock in your group, because you cannot get their raid buffs anywhere except DPS. That being said, one thing to keep in mind about raid meta in general is if you're not pushing cutting edge mythic progression, if you're an AOTC guild or you're a mythic guild that pushes later in the tier, you definitely do not need to play all of the meta classes. Just having 20 good players that can survive a fight is oftentimes enough to kill the boss. That being said, if you just want a sneak peek into what will probably be very strong in Dragonflight, this is the video for you. Let's get into the range DPS. Alright, so here we have all of the range DPS specs currently in the game. I've compiled this list based on information from how their kits function in Dragonflight. So inside of this chart, we have every single range spec. We have a brief snippet about their damage profiles and what they're good at. We have their DPS ranking out of a score of 5, so 1 through 5, 1 being the worst, 5 being the best. We have a brief list of all of their key utility. That's very powerful. Most of this stuff is class-wide, which is why you see duplicates here. And yeah, let's just go through class by class and talk about how they're all doing in Dragonflight right now. So first up on the list, we have Balanced Druid. Balanced Druid is probably the best spread AoE class in the game right now. The way Starfall works, they can just blast out spread AoE, and that's a very unique damage niche that some fights will need, but not all fights. Additionally, their single target damage is fine right now. I gave them an overall DPS ranking of 4 out of 5. They have really strong raid utility overall with Innervate, good off healing, Roar, and knockbacks, and they have a raid buff, which we need. So that's going to be earning them a range spot inside of our range DPS. Next on the list, we have Warlocks. So one of the key strengths of Warlocks is that they are practically unkillable inside of Raid. They have a billion different defensives and are just very tanky. Going down the list, we have Demonology Warlock first. They are the best burst AoE / stacked AoE Warlock class. I give them a DPS ranking of 5 because on fights that they excel at, they really excel and are one of the best in the game. If there's ever ad spawning that need to die quickly, the way Demonology Warlock works right now, they're extremely good at that. Would recommend having one. Destruction Warlock is probably the worst of the 3 Warlock specs. They're still good in a 2-target niche with the way their kit functions, but they're just not really great outside of that, and they're outshined by their other 2 specs in every other scenario. The 3rd Warlock spec, Affliction Warlock, is the single-target go-to for Warlock. Getting them a 4 out of 5 for DPS ranking. They're not quite as insane as Demonology Warlock on the fights they excel at, but in pure single-target, they will be Demonology Warlocks, and they are very powerful. In addition to that, Warlock also provides a raid buff, so we really need them in the roster anyway. I would highly recommend having either a Demonology or Affliction Warlock player in your raid. Moving on from Warlock, we have Shadow Priest. Shadow Priest unfortunately got about half of a rework and didn't quite get finished in time for Dragonflight for the 3rd expansion in a row, so they're really just not looking too hot. Their single target damage is okay. They're not the worst in the game. They're not the best. I give them a 2 out of 5 overall. There's no damage profile they really excel at. They're just going to be an okay part of your roster. Really, you would only bring one if you needed the raid buff. Otherwise, I would just give them a pass. Moving on from Priest, we have Mage. So Mage in general is one of the best classes of the game at doing raid mechanics with the amount of blinks they have, as well as an immunity. And Fire Mage having that cheat death, they're very powerful. They're also gaining Blast Wave in Dragonflight, which is going to be probably the strongest knockback, so it'll move mobs the furthest. Whether that's what you want or not really depends on the fight, but it will be there, and it's an option for Mage. So first on the list, we have Fire Mage. They really excel in single target situations. I give them a DPS ranking of 5 out of 5. They're gearing up to be probably one of the strongest DPS specs in the game. Next on the list, we have Frost Mage. Frost Mage is doing decently. They're not quite as overpowered as Fire Mage, but I give them a 3 out of 5. In fights they excel at, they will do well. So that's 2-target cleave and funnel damage, where you have like 4 small adds around 1 big add. Frost Mage will do very strong. Additionally, they have a double immunity, which always has some value. After Frost Mage, we have Arcane Mage. Arcane Mage is looking pretty strong, but not amazing. Fire Mage kind of just overshadows them. They do good stacked AoE damage, and they do good single target damage, but generally they're just overshadowed by Fire Mage in most fights. Overall, because Mage is tuned very strong and provides a raid buff, we're definitely going to want one in the roster, if not multiple. Moving on from Mage, we have Devastation Evoker. Devastation Evoker is tuned very strong at single target right now. They are also the new class in the game, and fortunately fairly simple to play. Arguably maybe even easier than Demon Hunter, which is kind of crazy. Additionally, they do provide a new raid buff, and the healing version of Evoker is a lot harder to play than the DPS version, so if you want one in your raid, I would really recommend taking it as a DPS. Because they're tuned strongly right now, and I really doubt Blizzard will release their new hero class without being strong, I think it's a very safe bet to have one in your raid at least. Moving down the list, we have Elemental Shaman. Unfortunately, Elemental Shaman just is tuned okay right now. They don't really excel at anything that other classes don't do better, and they don't really provide any utility that can't be gotten elsewhere, so unfortunately, there's really not a great reason to run an Elemental Shaman unless you have like a specialty player in your raid. Obviously, if they're great at the class, bring them, but nothing to write home about or recruit for. Last but not least, we have the Hunters. So Hunters actually gain quite a bit of defensiveness. They're not quite as tanky as something like a Warlock, but they're definitely not at the bottom of the barrel anymore. Beast Mastery Hunter is tuned extremely strong. They destroy in single target and AoE damage. I give them a 5 out of 5. They're definitely just something you're going to want to have in your raid, possibly multiple Beast Mastery Hunters, especially with how mobile that spec is. They're going to be able to do mechanics like no one's business. It's going to be fantastic. Marksmanship Hunter, on the other hand, is a very different story. They are probably the most down bad spec in the game right now. They're just tuned very poorly. Even on stacked AoE fights, you're getting outshined by Beast Mastery Hunter, and that's where MM Hunter has historically shined. I just don't see any reason to bring an MM Hunter into your raid right now. That spec desperately needs buffs if they want to ever be brought for anything. And so with that, we go back to our ideal roster, and I've populated the 5 specs that I recommended taking, so Mage, Warlock, Hunter, Balanced Druid, and Evoker. For these best fit slots, you would want to bring whatever class makes the most sense for that fight. So first and foremost, if you're missing raid buffs, you would want to bring whatever class provides that raid buff. So example, if you're missing Fort, you would bring a Shadow Priest. Outside of that, you would want to bring whatever specs damage profile makes the most sense for the fight, and what specs have the most utility you need. So if it's a fight like, for example, Castle Nathria on Council of Blood, where you need spread AoE, you'd want to bring Affliction Warlocks and Balanced Druids. If it was a fight where you need some kind of single target blasters, you would want to bring Fire Mages and Affliction Warlocks. That's kind of what these slots are for. So definitely mix and match what you want, but those are the classes that this should give you a better idea of what's good and bad right now. So moving into melee DPS, first off we have Feral Druid. Feral Druid is actually surprisingly tuned extremely well right now for historically being a very not thought of class. They're doing insane single target damage. They're tuned extremely strong. They provide Innervate and Roar as well as off healing with Nature's Vigil, so they have the class utility that they were previously lacking. Additionally, their burst AoE is actually fairly strong right now, giving them a really strong damage profile. They're one of probably the better melee DPS to take in slots where you don't need a specific raid buff or utility from a class, and generally they're just very valuable right now. I would recommend having a Feral Druid inside of your raid. Moving on from Feral Druid, we have all 3 of the Rogue specs. At the moment, Outlaw Rogue is the one that is by far shining the most. They have a 5 out of 5 for DPS ranking. They are absolutely blasting in pure single target as well as stacked AoE, up to 8 targets based on their talents. Outlaw Rogue is really just slamming a lot of DPS. They have an immunity, they have a cheat death. What's not to love about Outlaw Rogue? Definitely worth having in your group. Moving on from Outlaw Rogue, we have Assassination Rogue. They're definitely a pure single target spec, just the very heavy bleeds on a single target. At the moment, even in pure single target, they're falling behind Outlaw Rogue. Definitely not in a terrible spot, but they're definitely not great either. And finally, the last rogue spec, we have Subtlety Rogue. Subtlety Rogue's kind of been left in the dust by the other 2 specs. They're probably the worst one all around. The only damage niche they have that can give them some chance is Funnel. So if there's 5 or more targets and you really want to blast damage into a single one, they can just spam their spenders every other global, which is pretty valuable, but I really don't think there's any fights like this in this upcoming raid, and generally they're just kind of the weakest of the rogue specs. But overall, Rogue is very strong right now, especially Outlaw Rogue, and with that raid buff they are providing with the Trophic Poison, you're definitely going to want to have at least one in your raid. Now moving on from Rogue, we have the Warriors. The first Warrior spec, Arms Warrior, is the weaker of the 2 right now. They're falling behind in pure single target, but as normal, Warriors provide Rallying Cry and excellent raid healing cooldown, as well as massive execute. Generally, Arms Warrior will only really be brought in this raid in a pure 2-target fight, just because they have that over Fury Warrior, their counterpart. Fury Warrior, on the other hand, is doing better than Arms in single target and stacked AoE. Generally, they have very consistent AoE damage output with Whirlwind. Overall, both Warrior specs got a 3 out of 5 for DPS. They're definitely not overtuned right now, but they're definitely not incredibly weak either. In addition to providing a raid buff and rallying cry, it's definitely not something you would hate to have in your raid, but they're definitely not fully required. So I gave them a flex spot. Definitely something you could bring into your raid if you have space for it, but you could get away without a DPS warrior, especially with the strength of Prot Warrior, which we'll get to soon. Moving on from Warrior, we have Demon Hunter. Havoc Demon Hunter is tuned fairly well right now. They're probably the third strongest melee spec in the game, falling behind Feral Druid and Outlaw Rogue in terms of pure output. They do a lot of single target damage, as well as I-Beam dealing a ton of AoE damage, and Blade Rush. Havoc Demon Hunter is generally just very strong right now, and they provide darkness to your raid, as well as a raid buff, 5% magic damage. Definitely would not hate to see one in your group. Probably a little bit stronger than Warrior overall, but they still fall into the same spot where they're not absolutely required, but they're definitely a solid pick to fit into your lineup. After Demon Hunter, we have the two Death Knights. Unholy Death Knight right now is the better looking of the two specs. Unholy Death Knight really excels in pure single target, as well as burst AoE, as well as having a fantastic execute damage, arguably the best in the game. I gave them a 4 out of 5 for DPS. Very, very strong, especially on fights where you need grips and ad control. You're going to want an Unholy Death Knight. Frost Death Knight isn't doing too bad overall. They're definitely a bit weaker than Unholy. They fall behind in AoE. They will deal more damage than Unholy in a long-term cleave fight, so something like a Council, where you can just keep breath up for a ton of the fight. They will be powerful in that scenario, but outside of that, they're generally just weaker than Unholy right now. I gave them a 3 out of 5, whereas Unholy DK got a 4 out of 5. Unholy is a bit stronger at the moment. But yeah, definitely not a bad time to be a Frost DK. They're still fairly strong. Alright, moving on to Enhancement Shaman. Enhancement Shaman actually got sweeping changes in Dragonflight. In addition to gaining a ton of new tools and dealing pretty solid damage, Enhancement Shaman still comes with Wind Fury Totem, which gives your other melee DPS just additional damage. So bringing one into your roster to buff the other 4 melee that are in is just always going to be worth. Enhancement Shaman definitely deserves a raid spot. It's borderline a raid buff at this point. It's a ton of damage gain. And Enhancement Shaman itself is looking to deal really solid damage. I gave them a 4 out of 5 for DPS. Enhancement Shaman's just looking very good and heading into Dragonflight. Moving on from Enhancement Shaman, we have Survival Hunter. This is probably the spec that I'm very unqualified to talk about. No one in my guild actively made Survival Hunter. I played it a bit in Season 4 of Shadowlands when it was really strong in Mythic Plus, but the new version of Survival Hunter is just very different. There was no one really playing it in raid testing from what I saw. I gave it a 2 out of 5. I think their damage is decent. They're not as down bad as Hunter, but they're definitely not something amazing. They have really solid single target damage and really good uncapped AoE with their bombs, but they don't quite have the bomb spam that they had with the tier set at the end of Shadowlands. Overall, I would definitely not prioritize recruiting one for your raid comp, although if you have a specialist in your group, they're probably going to still do well. Moving on from Survival Hunter, we have Windwalker Monk. Windwalker Monk is the other melee DPS that's absolutely destroying right now. They got a 5 out of 5 for DPS ranking. They're just dealing a billion damage. They're very, very strong in single target, and they're also very, very strong in AoE fights. They have an entire side of their talent tree dedicated to each, and they can completely customize their build to fit one of the situations. Additionally, they're actually got a talent row, which gives them a avoidance to everyone in their party standing close to them, which is just a nice raid defensive to have on top of already having Mystic Touch, a pretty solid raid buff. And they have access to a ton of defensives. They're borderline unkillable. Windwalker Monk's just looking absolutely great. If you do not have one in your raid, you should definitely recruit for one, potentially even 2. Last on our list, we have Retribution Paladin. Retribution Paladin's actually doing fairly well right now. Their damage is respectable, especially in heavy cleave fights. They can keep up damage very nicely. They have pretty solid single target damage. I give them a 3 out of 5 overall. They're definitely not the highest DPS spec in the game, but they're definitely nowhere near the bottom either. They're doing very solid for themselves. The biggest problem with Retribution Paladin is they just have a real big lack of personal defenses. They have their immunity and they have their little bubble on themselves, but it's just not enough to stay alive compared to most other classes in the game. Unfortunately, Ret Paladin is kind of down bad in that case. And that wraps up all of our melee DPS. Over on the right here, you can see I put what my recommendations would be for the ideal raid comp for the optimal melee group. So Rogue and Monk are definitely hard required as they provide a raid buff, and the other alternatives to their raid buffs are just really not that great. I think Feral Druid, Death Knight, and Demon Hunter are the 3 strongest melee DPS in terms of just pure output. They're all very strong and tuned very well and excel in specific situations. Enhancement Shaman is very much like you need one in your raid. I think you would be hard to stack more than one to justify it. They're tuned fairly strong, but without the Wind Fury Totem pushing them over the edge, they're definitely not a must-have, but you definitely want at least one in your group. And last but not least, we have Warrior, who's always just a solid raid pick because of the power of Rallying Cry, as well as their strong execute, but they're not tuned amazingly well right now. And unfortunately, Survival Hunter and Retribution Paladin are really just not cutting it right now. I would recommend not really having one in your raid unless you have a specialist. And now we get into the raid healers. One thing I did want to quickly talk about is that HPS is not the end-all be-all of healer power. There are things healers can offer outside of pure HPS and throughput that provide a lot of value to the raid. The goal of a raid fight is to keep your raid alive. As long as everyone lives to the end of the fight, your healers did the best job they could. The actual HPS numbers are an indicator of how well they are doing, but they are not the absolute end-all be-all. And so with that, let's get into it. Let's start off talking about what we have on the screen here. So on the top left, we have unique and valuable healer utility. This is what I was talking about with things that are valuable that are not purely HPS and won't show up on the meter. So one of the most powerful cooldowns in the game, Discipline Priest Barrier, is a flat 25% DR for everyone who stands inside of it. It is a wildly powerful cooldown and does not touch your HPS at all. And it is their biggest 3-minute cooldown and probably the biggest 3-minute defensive in the game for a raid. And then other healers provide other utility that's not quite as powerful as that, but also are very good in their own ways. Holy Priests have Symbol of Hope, which now provides cooldown reduction on personal defensives. So things like Bark Skin get a free extra use, and other personal cooldowns, it's different by class, get massive cooldown reduction, if not a free use, out of Holy Priest pressing Symbol of Hope. Holy Paladins have Aura Mastery and Devotion Aura being the raid buff, Aura Mastery providing a 12% damage reduction. Very similar to Barrier, just slightly less potent, but it does go across a wider area as you don't have to stack inside of the barrier. Restoration Shaman, Spirit Lake Totem, very iconic ability, extremely powerful. It is a flat 10% damage reduction, and additionally, your entire raid shares a health pool while they're inside of it. For specific mechanics, this can actually be the most impactful raid cooldown in the game, but it's really fight dependent. Overall, it's a very strong piece of utility, but not the strongest in the game. And finally, we have Evokers with their new ability, Time Spiral. DPS and Healing Evokers both get this ability. When they press it, everyone else in your raid gets 10 seconds to press their class-specific mobility button. It changes based on class. A good example is Warriors, this Heroic Leap, and they can press that mobility button and use it one free time. It is a nice raid cooldown if you're trying to get out of some kind of AoE or something. It kind of falls into the same category as Roar and Windrush Totem, but it is a cool piece of utility that's not showed in the HPS. And so then we get to this graph here, the actual HPS meter. As you can see, Restoration Druid is really dominant on this graph. So this graph is actually pulled from the November 4th raid testing. This is specifically the Elemental Council fight. This is a fight that really favors mobile healers, which is why Restoration Druid is so far ahead of the pack. Don't get me wrong, Restoration Druid is doing very well right now, but they're not as ahead as this chart makes it seem. I just wanted to try and pull some numbers from the most recent testing that gave you an idea of the HPS. So you can see Restoration Druid, Holy Priest, and Mistweaver Monk are clearly doing extremely well. Preservation Evoker, Restoration Shaman, Holy Paladin, and Disciplined Priest on pure throughput are definitely a little bit lower, but that's not to say any of them are particularly weak or terrible. I actually think healer balance is in a pretty decent state right now, and let's talk about them all individually. Just based on pure numbers, you can see that Restoration Druid is doing extremely well right now. They are the most mobile healer in the game, able to just shoot out hots like nobody's business while on the move. And in addition to that, while they are lacking the non-HPS cooldowns, they have lots of HPS cooldowns. Between Tranquility and Flourish and Convoke the Spirits, they have lots of different cooldowns, and they can get massive Flourish ramps very often, every minute and a half, and just absolutely blast your raid with healing. They are the healer least affected by movement, which is very valuable on lots of different fights. Restoration Druid overall is just looking extremely strong. Definitely highly recommend having one on your roster going into Dragonflight. They are a little bit more replaceable than something like a Disc Priest or a Holy Paladin, just because they don't have any unique healing styles, but for throughputting healing, they are amazing right now. Moving down from Restoration Druid, we have Holy Priest. Holy Priest is in the same situation it was back in Sepulchre. They have Power Infusion for that damage. They have Symbol of Hope for that defensiveness. They also just have massive raw throughput. Holy Priest is looking to be a pretty powerful spec. Additionally, they are the only healer class that has the option of off-specking to Discipline Priest. So let's talk about Discipline Priest next. Discipline Priest narrowly avoided a change that would have killed the spec if the Evangelism got changed to a 3-minute cooldown for about 2 days, and the spec was in a very starry state for those 2 days, but that change has thankfully been reverted, and they just got some throughput nerfs. So they do have the lowest throughput numbers on these charts, but Discipline Priest as a spec maintains their 1 minute 30 second ramp windows, and in those windows, every minute 30 seconds, they are the absolute top healing, and it is a very, very powerful healing profile to be able to completely solo a mechanic every minute 30, making Discipline Priest borderline required. Any fight that has mechanics that happen every minute or so, Discipline Priest will be absolutely amazing at healing. They're a very powerful spec, and also being able to have your Discipline Priest swap off to Holy Priest on fights where Disc isn't as good is just so valuable. Honestly, Priest as a class is probably the best healer in the game right now. I would highly recommend recruiting a Priest healer if you don't already have one, especially with the Starry State Shadow is in. It provides a raid buff. Priest is just very likely going to be the best healer going into Dragonflight. Now, moving on from Priest, we have Mistweaver Monk. Mistweaver Monk is not doing bad. They are just a pure HPS class. They don't really provide any fantastic utility. They have Tiger's Lust, which is okay. Revival's a pretty good healing throughput cooldown, but they really are just HPS machines. They don't do a ton outside of that. So if you're covered with plenty of DRs from your other healers, you could definitely throw a Mistweaver Monk in there, but they're not something you should be actively recruiting for. They don't cover any niches that other healers can't handle, unfortunately. Moving on from Mistweaver Monk, we have Preservation Evoker. So Preservation Evoker is kind of an oddball. So currently, they are actually the single highest damage healer right now, as well as doing just an absolute boatload of healing when they can. They are really hamstringed by that 30-yard range, and it's going to make the class very interesting to play. I think the difference between a high-skill Preservation Evoker and a low-skill Preservation Evoker is going to be bigger than any other healer. Like, Discipline Priest previously was probably the hardest healer to play. I think Preservation Evoker is going to take the cake from that. They're going to have to play extremely smart around both positioning and utility and mobility spells. They have lots of mobility to themselves, but they have to use it to get in range and heal people. They really can't use it to just save themselves, and so that's going to make the spec extremely hard to play. However, if they are played at the highest level, I think Preservation Evokers are doing very, very respectable HPS, especially if people haven't mastered the class yet, so that'll only get higher, and they do have a potential to be an extremely powerful class. So if you have a player who's willing to put in the time and learn Preservation Evoker, they are absolutely worth bringing, and I think they will provide a lot to your raid. It's just going to be very difficult to play, especially with that 30-yard range. Moving on from Preservation Evoker, we have Restoration Shaman. Restoration Shaman is in a little bit of a sorry state. They've always kind of been the mix between the throughput healers and the DR healers, except their DR is kind of more situational than Aura Mastery and Barrier, so they're not quite as powerful on that front. Their throughput is pretty solid. They're doing reasonable throughput, but they don't provide any raid buff. They provide Windrush Totem, but that can easily be picked up by either Evokers or Shamans or Druids and other roles. They're not bad overall. If you have a Specialist Restoration Shaman player, they'll absolutely be fine, but definitely not in the best state right now. I would not be looking to recruit one if you don't already have some. Moving on from Restoration Shaman, we have Holy Paladin. Holy Paladin is gaining back the BFA caster healing playstyle if they want to, but I actually think the melee playstyle is still just going to be stronger. No other healer in the game has the kind of instant cast, like top healing, snap healing that Paladin provides, and they are maintaining that profile in the melee form that they can run in their talent tree. And I think Holy Paladin is just going to be extremely valuable. No other class provides that kind of off healing. In addition to that, because the state of Ret Paladin, unless you're running a Protection Paladin, you really want that Devotion Aura, and Holy Paladin is probably your best bet for finding it. I think every raid is going to run at least Holy Paladin for every single fight in the tier, and I really just don't see that changing. I would definitely look to pick up a Holy Paladin if you're lacking one in Dragonflight. And with that, that covers all of the healing specs. As you can see on the right, I've put down the healers that I would most recommend. So I think Disc, Priest, and Holy Priest together make up the single best healing class combination, especially with the absolute variety you can have playing both specs. Holy Paladin is maintaining their power, being that snap healing healer, and providing massive DRs with Aura Mastery, just a great class overall. And then I think Restoration Druid and Evoker are, in my opinion, the two top raw throughput healers at the moment, but you could absolutely mix and match Evoker and Restoration Druid with Mistweaver Monk and Restoration Shaman. It really just depends what you have in your roster. And also the numbers are likely to change on who's actually doing the most flat throughput. I would keep in mind that Preservation Evoker is definitely not going to be something easy to pick up. It'll take some time to master. And with that, let's move on from our healers to our tanks. So on this chart here, you can see I've compiled all the 6 tank specs, and I have a little checklist here of different things that are happening with all the tanks. So tanks as a role in Raid is actually much more about rounding out your roster than it is about playing which specific tank is the most powerful at the time. But that being said, you do still want a tank that can survive. So let's just go through this chart here. So first we have the raid buff column. With the change of Guardian Druid bringing Mark of the Wild, Blood Death Knight is actually the only tank that does not provide a raid buff. That being said, they do still provide Death Grip, which is required on some fights, so they definitely have raid utility to provide. And remember, their AMZ is not nerfed nearly as hard as the DPS Death Knight version, so they are still fairly strong, But if you're trying to just round out all the raid buffs on your roster, Death Knight is not required, which kind of hurts them a little bit. Another thing is there was recently a change where every single player's health bar and mob damage went up by a flat 40%. This is essentially a nerf to all healing that does not scale with percent HP or damage reduction. So warriors like Protection Warrior have a lot of healing through Indomitable, which scales with percent HP, and a lot of their defensives are just through flat mitigation with Ignore Pain, which don't really care if their HP bar change, it'll still mitigate the same amount of damage. So that being said, this does inadvertently affect some tanks more than others. Brewmaster Monk and Protection Paladin don't really have a lot of percent-based healing, and they don't really have as much percent DR as the other tanks, so they got kind of just flat-out nerfed compared to the other tanks, whereas Blood Death Knight, while they are taking 40% more damage, they have 40% more health to live, and their healing from Death Strike will be exactly the same percentage-wise relative to their health, because it doesn't care what the health number is, it's all percentage-based. So with that in mind, I think we should be looking out to see if Brew and Protection Paladin get some buffs to compensate for this, but it kind of put them a slight bit behind the other tanks on this list. Moving on from that, as far as damage goes, every single tank is doing fairly well in damage, except Guardian Druid, who got absolutely massive buffs today, 50% buffs since I made this chart. So I actually think Guardian Druid's damage is going to go from poor to fairly strong overall, if not one of the best. And the other thing to note is, at the moment, Blood Death Knight is the best single target damage right now. So if you're looking for pure throughput on a single target boss, Blood Death Knight is the best. And then I have this little additional utility column, but it's very similar to other specs we've covered before. You can just take a look at that if you want. So as far as my recommendations for what tank you should run, let's go down the list. So I think first and foremost, you want to run a tank that fills your raid buff slot. So look at the rest of your roster and then see, okay, what raid buffs are we missing? Do I need to pick up a tank for that? And then pick up that tank. As far as tank power goes right now, they're actually all fairly even. I think Protection Warrior and Vengeance Demon Hunter and Blood Death Knight are the three best right now, and I'll go over the reasons why. So Protection Warrior has gotten back their BFA-style Thunderclap build inside of Avatar, where they just deal massive single target and AoE damage, as well as having well enough 100% uptime on shield block and just massive ignore pains throughout. They are doing massive self-healing with a ton of leech inside of their talent tree, giving them enough self-sustain to not even be required to heal as much as they used to. Protection Warrior is just looking fantastic going into Dragonflight. Vengeance Demon Hunter is very similar to Protection Warrior. They're getting back all of their Covenant abilities that are very powerful. They are getting back Spirit Bomb. They're dealing a ton of damage. They have a lot of self-sustain. They're not as reliant on giant AoE pulls as they were at the end of Shadowlands. It's going to make them a very solid tank overall, and they still provide that great raid buff as well as darkness and a fantastic cheat death. Vengeance Demon Hunter is looking like a great option. Blood Death Knight is probably still the king of self-sustain as a tank. If you're taking damage that's not one-shotting you, you're just never going to die. They have tons of utility. They're maintaining a lot of their builds from the end of Shadowlands that have pretty solid uptime on that 60% parry, and they're just going to be pretty unkillable as a raid tank. They're just going to be very strong. Blood Death Knight's looking very good. Brewmaster Monk is unfortunately the tank with the least self-sustain. They are pretty reliant on healers paying attention to them. That being said, they are pumping out a lot of damage right now, and they do provide that raid buff. I'm sure there will be ways for them to survive raid fights, even if they'll be a little bit squishier than the other tanks. So they're definitely a solid option if you need to pick up that raid buff. Otherwise, I would look elsewhere for a tank, as Brew is falling behind a little bit. Protection Paladin, providing that coveted Devotion Aura raid buff. If you're missing that, I would definitely recommend picking up one as your tank. They are dealing very solid damage right now, and they have pretty good self-sustain. They don't quite have the insane holy power income that they had for a lot of Shadowlands, with it being removed from Avenger's Shield. So there's not going to be as much off-healing onto your raid, but they're definitely able to sustain themselves pretty solid. They did get hit pretty hard by the 40% health change, putting them a little bit behind other tanks. I kind of expect Blizzard to buff them to compensate for this, but if that doesn't happen, I definitely think Protection Paladin's going to just fall further behind. If you're missing Devotion Aura, I would definitely pick one up as your tank, but if you're not missing that raid buff, I would look elsewhere to Prot Warrior, Vengeance, and Blood. Finally, last on the list, we have Guardian Druid. I ranked Guardian Druid as the worst tank because their damage was just so low, and I feel like Guardian Druid as a spec scales extremely well in large AoE target situations, but in raid and single target fights, they really just don't have a lot of tools to make them strong in any way, and all of their defenses are very long cooldown with no real way to reduce them. That being said, they did just get flat 50% damage buffs on all of their throughput, as well as some additional DR from Moonfire going from 5% to 10%. So they are going to be a bit tankier and deal a bit more damage than when I created this list. So they're definitely going to be solid overall. If you're missing the Mark of the Wild raid buff, Guardian Druid is your go-to. Otherwise, I would look elsewhere. I think Protection Warrior, Vengeance Demon Hunter, and Blood Death Knight are going to be the top 3 tanks going into Dragonflight. And so with that, we come to our final roster. As you can see, I have all of the raid buffs on the left side of the screen, so you can see what we have to offer. These are my recommendations if you want to start looking for a roster to recruit. The most important thing is you have all of the raid buffs covered, as well as the option to have a Death Knight in for the required grips. A lot of the raid fights in this raid require grips, so I would really recommend having 1 to 2 Death Knights on your roster. It's going to be very, very necessary. And going through that, I have created this page here where I have some sample comps. Take a look at those if you want. This is for specific fight styles, the actual specs that I would try and stack for those fights. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. I'm putting out my M Plus guide soon for what I think will be meta there. And maybe in a few weeks after Dragonflight comes out, we can come back and make fun of all my dumb opinions and how wrong I was about how strong these specs are. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe. Leave a comment. See you later.